The wind swept across the Wyoming plains, carrying the scent of dust and destiny. That night, under a bruised sky, a desperate trade was made. A woman exchanged for an old horse. Her name was Margaret Holloway, and from that moment her life was no longer her own. But fate had other plans. On a lonely ranch, a wounded man and a broken woman would meet, not as savior and captive, but as two souls haunted by what they'd lost, and by what they might still find in each other. A tale of courage, redemption, and forbidden tenderness begins here. If you love stories of impossible love and second chances, subscribe now and help us reach 1,000 hearts who believe, like Margaret and Thomas, that love can rise even from the dust. Abilene, Kansas, 1881. The sun was already sinking when the wagons stopped on the edge of Thomas Rourke's ranch, throwing long, trembling shadows across the prairie grass. The day had been cruelly hot, but now a faint wind rose, carrying the scent of dust and horses. In that dim light, a woman stood beside the wagon, small, thin, her hands clutching a worn carpetbag as though it held her last breath of dignity. Her name was Margaret Holloway. The gambler who brought her down the road swung from the seat with the swagger of a man who believed the world owed him comfort. "A fair trade," he said, voice rasping. "One horse for the girl. She'll serve you well enough if you keep her fed." Thomas's expression darkened. He stood tall, broad-shouldered beneath the fading sun, his eyes the color of aged whiskey. His dust coat hung open, revealing a shirt worn from work, not vanity. "I don't trade in people," he said evenly, "and I don't take what isn't freely given." The gambler laughed, his teeth yellowed by whiskey and deceit. "Then consider her payment for the debt you refused to acknowledge. The horse was mine. The girl's yours now. Do what you will." Margaret's heart pounded so loudly she thought the men could hear it. The gambler's boots crushed the earth as he climbed back onto the wagon. The whip cracked, and he was gone, leaving only the echo of wheels and the dust rising behind him. Silence fell between them. Thomas looked at the woman before him, thin from hunger, eyes wide with exhaustion. "Did you agree to this?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "No, sir. I didn't agree to anything." Her voice trembled, but she met his eyes, refusing to cry. He nodded once, grave and quiet. "Then you're not bound to me. You can rest here tonight if you wish. There's work at this ranch if you need it, but no one here owns you." Her throat tightened. No one had ever spoken those words to her before. Inside the ranch house, Mrs. Della Crowley, the housekeeper, met them with a sharp intake of breath. "Lord above," she muttered, taking in the girl's pale face and dust-streaked dress. "Bring her in, Mr. Rourke, before she faints dead away." Margaret hesitated on the porch. The threshold looked like a line between two worlds. Behind her, humiliation and fear. Before her, a silence she did not yet understand. She stepped inside. The house smelled of wood smoke and faint soap. The furnishings were plain but well cared for. A low fire burned in the hearth, the light dancing across the walls. Della led Margaret to a small chair near the warmth. "Sit, child. You look like you've been walking through the devil's own dust." "I can work," Margaret whispered, "if you'll let me stay." Della's sharp eyes softened. "We'll see about that after you've eaten something." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his hat still in his hand. "You'll stay the night," he said. "I'll send word to town in the morning about this trade. No one will accuse me of keeping what's not mine." She turned toward him, her voice quiet but steady. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Rourke. I've been passed from one man's bargain to another for most of my life. I don't expect kindness." For a long moment, he said nothing. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them. "Maybe you should," he replied finally, his voice low. "Kindness doesn't cost what men think it does." Margaret lowered her gaze, afraid of what her tears might reveal. Later, when the house had grown quiet, she sat by the small window of the guest room, staring at the endless dark beyond the glass. The wind pressed against the walls, and the prairie whispered secrets in the night. Below, she heard Thomas moving through the house, his footsteps slow, deliberate. He checked the latches on the doors, the windows, every lock. It was a ritual of protection, not suspicion, and somehow, knowing that he did so made her feel, for the first time in years, almost safe. Outside, the moon rose pale and steady over the land. Margaret pressed her palm against the cool glass and whispered to herself, "If there is mercy left in this world, let me find it here." Downstairs, Thomas paused by the dying fire, his hand resting on the mantel. He looked toward the stairs and thought of the woman sleeping under his roof, broken, but not defeated. "You're safe here," he murmured to the empty room, though she could not hear him. The wind answered with a low sigh through the boards, as if the prairie itself bore witness to a fragile promise, one that neither of them yet knew would change both their lives forever. The first light of dawn stretched softly across the plains, touching the Rourke ranch with a pale golden hue. The air smelled of dew, dry hay, and wood smoke, an aroma that belonged entirely to the frontier, as familiar to Thomas Rourke as the beating of his own heart. From the open barn door, he watched the slow awakening of his land, a few restless cattle lowing in the distance, a horse pawing at the earth, and the sound of a kettle beginning to whistle from inside the house. Margaret Holloway stood at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair tied back in a loose bun that revealed the delicate line of her neck. Della Crowley, the housekeeper, had given her work to do before sunrise, nothing too heavy, just peeling potatoes and sweeping the hearth. Margaret had taken to it with the silent determination of a woman who understood that survival depended on usefulness. Della watched her for a while, wiping her hands on her apron. "You've got a good way with order," she said, her voice brisk but not unkind. "No fuss, no waste. Mr. Rourke values that." Margaret hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the door that led outside. "He seems fair," she said softly. "Fair's the right word for him," Della replied, pouring coffee into a tin mug. "Fair and quiet. Too quiet, if you ask me. That man carries more in his chest than he ever lets out." When Thomas entered, his boots tracked dust across the wooden floor, and his presence seemed to fill the room at once. He greeted Della with a nod, then stopped short at the sight of Margaret working. She straightened instinctively, gripping the broom handle. The morning light touched her face, making her eyes appear more green than grey. "You're up early," he said. "I woke with the sun," she replied, trying to steady her voice. "I thought it best to make myself useful." Della cut in before either could say more. "She's been a help already. I could use another pair of hands, and the place hasn't looked this tidy in months." Thomas set his hat down on the table and looked at Margaret for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "If you stay," he said finally, "you'll work for wages like anyone else, and you'll take your meals here. You don't owe me anything." Her fingers tightened around the broom. "I'm not used to being paid fairly." He glanced toward the window, where the prairie wind stirred the curtains. Maybe it's time someone changed that. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to still, the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the fire, all fading into silence. Margaret felt something unfamiliar twist inside her, the quiet ache of being seen without judgment. She turned away before he could read too much of her heart in her gaze. After breakfast, Thomas headed out to the pastures, and Margaret followed Della to the laundry behind the house. They hung damp linens on the line, while the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. "Is he always so serious?" Margaret asked, her voice tentative. Della chuckled. "Serious? That man's a walking sermon in boots. He's got the weight of the ranch on his shoulders. The bank's been breathing down his neck since spring, and the herd's smaller than it ought to be. But he'll never tell you that. Not his way." Margaret's eyes drifted to the horizon. "He looks like someone who's forgotten what peace feels like." "You'd be right," Della said, pinning another sheet to the line. "But don't pity him, child. Thomas Rourke's heart may be tired, but it's not weak. He just doesn't know where to rest it." Later that day, Margaret ventured out to the corral, carrying a pail of water. The sunlight caught in her hair, and the hem of her dress lifted in the warm wind. Thomas was there, fixing a broken fence post, sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms marked by years of labor. The rhythmic motion of his work fascinated her, the strength, the silence, the purpose. When he noticed her, he paused. "You shouldn't be carrying that alone," he said, taking the pail from her hands. Their fingers brushed, only for a heartbeat, yet enough to send a current through her entire body. "I'm not made of glass," she murmured, though her voice trembled. "I didn't say you were," he replied quietly, setting the pail down. "But there's no harm in letting someone else take the weight now and then." She gave a faint smile. "That's not something I've ever been allowed." His gaze softened. "Then maybe you've been surrounded by the wrong kind of people." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind whistled through the dry grass, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. Thomas bent down again to his work, but his mind was no longer on the fence. He felt her presence behind him, like warmth on his back, steady and fragile all at once. As the day wore on, Margaret took to the routines of the household with quiet discipline. She helped Della prepare supper, learned where the tools were kept, and began to understand the rhythm of the ranch, the honest fatigue of men returning at dusk, the sound of boots on the porch, the laughter of the stable hands that faded respectfully when she entered the room. They were kind, but wary. She was a mystery they could not yet name. That evening Thomas returned late, his clothes streaked with dust, his jaw shadowed by a day's work. The light from the lamp cast a golden glow across the kitchen. Margaret was setting the table when he entered. "You didn't have to wait up," he said, removing his hat. "I wasn't tired," she answered. "And I thought you might be hungry." He gave her a small, almost surprised smile. "I usually eat alone." "Then perhaps you shouldn't." The simplicity of her words struck him more deeply than she could have imagined. They sat across from each other in the flickering lamplight, the silence between them no longer awkward, but charged with something unspoken. Della had retired for the night, leaving them to the quiet comfort of clinking plates and the low crackle of the fire. "Where are you from, Margaret?" Thomas asked after a while. "Nowhere worth mentioning," she said softly. "Every place I've lived has belonged to someone else." "That doesn't mean you don't belong anywhere," he said. She lifted her eyes to his, uncertain whether to believe him. "And where does a woman like me belong, Mr. Rourke?" He hesitated, his voice low. "Where she's treated as more than what she's endured." Her chest tightened, and she turned slightly away, afraid that one more kind word would undo her. "People don't usually talk that way out here." "Maybe they should," he murmured. A sudden gust of wind pressed against the shutters, making the lamp flicker. Margaret rose to close the window, but Thomas reached it first. Their hands brushed again, and she froze. The lamplight caught on her face, pale skin, weary eyes, the faintest trembling of her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping back. He studied her for a moment, then said softly, "You don't have to thank me for decency." "I do," she replied, "because it's rare." Thomas looked away, jaw tight. "It shouldn't be." When she left the kitchen, his gaze followed her to the stairs. There was something about the way she moved, cautious yet graceful, that made him ache with a protectiveness he did not understand. Later that night, as the house settled into stillness, Thomas stood alone on the porch. The stars burned cold above the plains, and the distant howl of a coyote echoed through the hills. He leaned against the post, the brim of his hat in his hand, and thought of the woman asleep upstairs. He had not asked for her, nor did he deserve the strange peace her presence brought, but already he could feel her quietness softening the edges of his solitude. He imagined her in that small room, breathing evenly, her hair undone, her hands finally resting instead of clutching at survival. Something deep within him stirred, a longing not for possession, but for closeness untainted by fear. Inside, Margaret sat by her small window again, watching the vastness outside. The prairie was silver in the moonlight, endless and silent. She had never felt so small, nor so strangely safe. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas's voice, the calm steadiness of it, the way it carried neither pity nor demand. She wondered what kind of man spoke gently in a world that only understood power. Her fingers brushed the fabric of her dress, rough from years of wear. She remembered his words. Maybe it's time someone changed that. They lingered like a whisper she wanted to believe. Downstairs, Thomas finally extinguished the lamp and turned toward the stairway. His boots made no sound on the worn boards. He paused outside her door, not to intrude, but to make certain she was safe. From within came the faintest sound of movement, then stillness. He lowered his voice to barely a murmur. "Sleep well, Miss Holloway. You're safe here." He walked away before she could answer, but Margaret had heard him. Her eyes filled with quiet tears, not of fear, but of something far gentler. Outside, the wind swept across the open plains, carrying the scent of rain and new beginnings. And in that house of wood and silence, two souls who had forgotten tenderness began, without knowing it, to relearn the fragile art of belonging. The wind rose early that morning, carrying with it the smell of rain that never came. Dust rolled across the plains like restless ghosts, sweeping through the Rourke ranch and settling in fine layers over everything that dared to stand still. Margaret Holloway was in the yard before sunrise, shaking out a clean sheet, her hair tied in a loose bun that the wind kept trying to undo. She had been at the ranch only a short while, but she had already fallen into its rhythm. The quiet mornings, the long silences, the way every gesture seemed to matter more than words. From the barn, Thomas Rourke watched her. He told himself it was because she worked too hard, that she should rest more. But the truth, one he refused to name even in thought, was that something about her calm defiance unsettled him. She moved with care, her head slightly bowed, but her eyes, when she lifted them, held the same stubborn light as the prairie sky. "Morning, Miss Holloway," he called. She turned, her dress brushing against her boots. "Good morning, Mr. Rourke. The sheets will never dry in this wind. Let them dance a little," he said, faintly smiling. "The air does what it pleases." She gave a small laugh, soft and unexpected, like the first bird after a storm. Thomas felt the sound settle inside him before he looked away, pretending to check the harness on a nearby horse. By mid-morning, two riders approached from the south road. Della, standing on the porch, saw them first and muttered, "Bank men." Thomas's expression hardened. "Stay inside," he told her quietly, then turned to Margaret. "You too." But she didn't move. "They're from the bank?" "Yes," he said shortly. "And they're not here to be neighborly." The men rode up with dust on their coats and arrogance in their posture. One dismounted slowly, adjusting his gloves as though he were preparing for something unpleasant. "Mr. Rourke," he said, his voice oily. "Mr. Harlan Vickers sends his regards. We're here to inspect collateral." Thomas crossed his arms. "There's no cause for that. The next payment isn't due until the end of the month." The man smiled. "Times change. The bank's interests change with them." He glanced toward the fields, toward the few cattle grazing in the distance. "Seems a modest herd for such a large loan." Thomas's jaw tightened. "The herd is enough, and this is private property." The man's smile sharpened. "The bank disagrees." He took a step forward, and the tension thickened like thunder. Margaret could see it from where she stood in the doorway, the straight line of Thomas's shoulders, the stillness in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "You'll turn your horses around now. Whatever business Mr. Vickers has with me, he'll conduct it in writing. If you set foot past that fence again, you'll regret it." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the man gave a mocking bow and mounted again. "You've got spirit, Rourke. Shame about your luck." They rode off, leaving behind a swirl of dust and something heavier, an invisible threat that clung to the air long after they were gone. When the silence returned, Margaret stepped down from the porch. "You didn't have to face them alone," she said softly. Thomas turned toward her, his eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. I didn't want you near them." "I'm not made of glass," she replied. "I know that," he said, his tone gentler now. "But some men see kindness and mistake it for weakness. I won't let them near you." Margaret swallowed, her throat tight. "Why do you care?" He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Because no one should be traded or threatened on my land. Not again." Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding deeper than either dared to name. That afternoon the sky grew heavy with clouds, though the rain still refused to fall. Thomas repaired a broken fence post by the west pasture, while Margaret fetched water and feed for the horses. When one of the mares startled, her reins twisted in Margaret's hands, jerking hard enough to pull her forward. Thomas was beside her in an instant. "Easy," he murmured, his hand covering hers. "You're holding too tight." She froze. The warmth of his palm against her skin sent a rush of heat through her body. He guided her hand slowly, their fingers moving together until the horse stilled, its breathing calming to match their own. "See?" he said quietly. "If you breathe steady, they will too." Margaret nodded, unable to find her voice. When she finally looked up, she realized how close they stood. His shirt was open at the collar, the fabric darkened with sweat, his scent a mix of leather and dust, and something entirely his own. For one dangerous second, the air between them seemed to hum with something fragile and forbidden. She stepped back quickly, her cheeks flushed. "Thank you," she whispered. He watched her retreat, his chest rising with slow, controlled breaths. "You did well," he said finally. "Most people panic when a horse pulls. You held your ground." Margaret tried to smile, though her heart still raced. "Maybe I've had practice standing my ground." "I don't doubt it," he said. That evening, Della prepared supper early, but neither Margaret nor Thomas had much appetite. The encounter with the bankmen had left the house quieter than usual. Margaret sat by the small window in the kitchen, mending a torn sleeve. Thomas leaned against the doorway, his hat in his hands. "You shouldn't have been out there," he said again, his tone softer now. "Those men aren't like the ones who work this land. They smile when they lie, and they don't leave until they've taken something." "I know they're kind," she replied. "I've seen men like that ruin families just because they could." Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly. "You sound as if you've lived it." She hesitated, then nodded. "My stepfather gambled everything we had. The man he owed took what little was left, our house, our dignity, and still demanded more. That's how I was sold." Thomas went still. "You were a child, old enough to remember every word," she said, her voice shaking despite herself. "He said I was strong enough to work and too proud to beg. That made me worth something." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, a muscle working in his jaw. "If I ever meet that man..." She shook her head. "He's gone. The dead can't hear anger." For a moment neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, and the scent of bread lingered in the air. "Margaret," Thomas said quietly, "you're safe here. I can't change what happened before, but I can promise that no one will touch you without your say." Her eyes glistened. "Why would you promise that? You don't even know me." "Because I see what kind of woman you are," he said, "and I won't let the world teach you fear all over again." She looked down at her hands, trembling slightly over the fabric she was sewing. "I'm not sure I remember how to stop being afraid." "Then I'll remind you," he replied. His voice was low, almost a whisper, "as many times as it takes." Margaret's breath caught. She couldn't look at him, not with the weight of those words pressing into her heart. When she finally glanced up, he had turned away, as if afraid of what might happen if he stayed. Later, after Della retired, Margaret stepped outside to fetch the last of the linens. The moon was pale, half hidden by clouds. She gathered the fabric into her arms, her thoughts spinning like leaves in the wind. She was still standing there when she heard footsteps behind her. "Can't sleep either?" Thomas asked, his voice roughened by fatigue. "No," she admitted. "The wind sounds like it's carrying secrets tonight." He smiled faintly. "It always does. The prairie never forgets what it's seen." Margaret hesitated. "Do you ever regret staying here?" He looked out across the land. Every man thinks of leaving, at least once. But this place, it's all I know. My father built the first fences with his bare hands. My mother cooked by that same hearth inside. Sometimes I think the land remembers them more kindly than I do." She studied him, her voice soft. "You carry too much." He turned toward her, his eyes unreadable. "And you carry too little for yourself. Maybe that's why we understand each other." Her heart stuttered. "Do we?" "I think so," he said. "You keep your pain folded neatly, like those sheets you bring in every night. But I see it, Margaret. I see the courage it takes to keep standing." Her throat tightened. "You shouldn't look so closely, Mr. Rourke." "Maybe I can't help it." The air between them thickened with quiet emotion. Margaret clutched the linen against her chest, feeling her pulse quicken. He reached out, not to touch her, but to take the fabric from her arms. Their hands brushed again, and she felt the warmth of his skin through the thin cotton. "Go inside," he said softly. "It's getting cold." She lingered for a moment longer. "Thank you for standing up to those men today." He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd do it again." When she stepped back into the house, she felt the echo of his words long after he had turned away. That night, as she lay in bed, Margaret dreamed of horses running across endless fields, wild, unbroken, free. And though she woke before dawn, heart racing, she realized something strange and quiet had changed inside her. For the first time since she could remember, she did not wake to fear. She woke to possibility. Downstairs, Thomas sat alone at the table, staring at the bank papers spread before him. His hand brushed the faint mark left by her sewing needle on the fabric she'd mended earlier. He let out a slow breath, the kind a man gives when he knows something precious has begun, something fragile and fierce that no debt could ever measure. The morning began with the promise of warmth. The prairie air shimmered faintly under the rising sun, and for a brief moment the Rourke ranch looked like it belonged to another world, one untouched by struggle or debt. Margaret Holloway stepped out of the house with her hair pinned neatly and a basket balanced on her arm. She had mended her only serviceable dress, a soft grey calico that caught the light like worn silk. Della Crowley followed her to the porch, tying her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Mind the town, child," Della warned. "They talk too much and listen too little." Margaret smiled faintly. "I only need a few things for the kitchen. I'll be back before supper." Della's eyes flicked toward the barn, where Thomas Rourke was saddling his horse. "Then you'll have company. He's riding in too." Margaret turned quickly, surprise lighting her face. "He's going to town." Della gave a knowing look. "Seems the bank won't wait much longer, and Mr. Rourke doesn't leave things undone." Moments later, Thomas appeared, his dark coat buttoned, his hat shading his eyes from the sun. He looked composed, but there was tension in the set of his jaw, a weight that hadn't left him since the men from the bank had come. When he saw Margaret waiting by the gate, he hesitated, adjusting the reins as though to steady himself. "I'll take you as far as Main Street," he said. "Safer that way." "I can manage on my own," she replied gently. "I know you can," he said, mounting his horse, "but I'd rather you didn't have to." The ride to Abilene was quiet, but not uncomfortable. The road curved through open fields, the horizon stretching endlessly, broken only by the faint shapes of windmills and distant cattle. The spring wind carried the scent of grass and earth, and Margaret found herself breathing deeper, feeling freer than she had in years. At the edge of town, the noise began. Wagon wheels clattering, voices calling, a blacksmith's hammer striking metal. Abilene was small, but proud. Its people wore their decency like armor. Margaret felt eyes turn toward her as soon as she stepped down from the wagon. She knew that look well, the blend of curiosity and quiet condemnation reserved for women without clear place or family. Thomas dismounted and held out his hand. "The mercantile's just there," he said, nodding toward a wooden building trimmed in faded green paint. She accepted his hand, her fingers brushing against his glove. The contact was brief, but the warmth lingered longer than it should have. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. I'll see the banker and meet you here when I'm done." Inside the mercantile, the smell of flour, leather and old wood filled the air. Margaret moved quietly among the aisles, choosing coffee, salt, and a few bolts of cloth. Behind the counter, Mrs. Carver, the owner's wife, watched her like a hawk over its prey. "New face in town," Mrs. Carver said, her voice sweetly sharp. "You staying long, dear?" Margaret folded her hands. "I work for Mr. Rourke, at his ranch." The woman's eyebrows rose. "Work, is it? People do say Mr. Rourke's taken in company before." Margaret froze. "I'm his housekeeper," she said firmly. Mrs. Carver's smile thinned. "Of course, dear. The plains can be lonely." Margaret's cheeks burned, but she did not answer. She gathered her purchases quickly, trying to ignore the whispers that fluttered behind her like dry leaves. When she turned to leave, she nearly collided with a man entering the shop. It was Harlan Vickers. His suit was as dark as a crow's wing, and his boots shone too clean for prairie dust. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Miss Holloway," he said smoothly, "I've heard of you." She stiffened. "Then you've heard lies." He chuckled softly. "Oh, I don't believe everything I hear. But people talk, and it's a pity, isn't it? A woman's reputation is such a fragile thing." She lifted her chin. "My reputation is my own concern." "I'm sure it is," he said, stepping closer. His cologne was strong, cloying. "But if I were you, I'd tread carefully. Mr. Rourke's debts run deep, and the company he keeps may come under scrutiny." Before Margaret could answer, the door opened again, and Thomas stepped inside. His expression darkened the instant he saw Vickers. "Mr. Vickers," he said, his voice cold, "you have business with me, not with her." Vickers smiled, all false politeness. "Ah, Mr. Rourke, just exchanging pleasantries. Your companion is quite the conversationalist." "She's not my companion," Thomas said tightly. "She's my employee, and you'll speak to her with respect." For a moment the two men stared at each other, the air between them sharp as glass. Then Vickers gave a mocking bow. "As you wish. But I'd advise you to watch your affairs closely, Rourke. The plains have eyes and tongues sharper than knives." He left with the sound of his polished boots echoing against the floorboards. Thomas turned to Margaret. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "I'm fine." "You shouldn't have to listen to that kind of talk," he said, lowering his voice. "Not here, not anywhere." "It doesn't matter," she murmured. "I'm used to worse." "It matters to me." Their eyes met, and in that instant, the noise of the mercantile, the town, the whole world seemed to fall away. Thomas's expression softened, the anger fading into something else, something that made Margaret's breath catch. When they stepped back outside, the light had shifted. Clouds drifted over the sun, casting the street in muted gold. Margaret gathered her things, and Thomas took the heavier basket without a word. "You don't have to," she began. "I know," he interrupted quietly, "but I want to." They walked together down Main Street. The townspeople watched from porches and storefronts, some whispering, some pretending not to. Margaret could feel the weight of every glance like pins against her skin. Thomas noticed it too. When a pair of women crossed to the other side of the street, he stopped. "Hold your head up," he said softly. She blinked at him. "What?" "Don't let them see you bend." Her throat tightened. "You don't understand. They'll never forgive me for existing outside their rules." "Then let them choke on their rules," he said. "You owe them nothing." His voice held such quiet fire that it startled her. For a moment, she could almost believe him. When they reached the wagon, Margaret turned to him. "You shouldn't have defended me in there," she said. "People will think—" "Let them think," he said, cutting her off. "I'm done letting cowards decide who deserves kindness." She looked at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," he said. "But you face them anyway. That's what decency costs in a place like this." As they rode back, the wind picked up again, tugging strands of hair from Margaret's bun. She felt strangely alive, her heart unsteady but full. Thomas didn't speak for a long time. His hands were steady on the reins, his gaze fixed on the horizon, yet his thoughts were far from the road. He had faced men with guns, droughts that ruined crops, debts that ate through pride. But nothing had undone him quite like watching Margaret Holloway stand tall in a room full of judgment and refuse to bow. When they reached the ranch, Della was waiting on the porch. She took one look at their faces and said, "Town went as bad as I feared, didn't it?" Thomas gave a curt nod. "Nothing we can't handle." Margaret managed a small smile. "I brought the sugar you asked for." Della took the parcel, eyeing her knowingly. "You also brought back a storm, child. Best keep your heart steady. The wind's turning." That evening Margaret sat at the table sewing by lamplight. Thomas lingered nearby, pretending to review ledgers but not turning a single page. Outside, the crickets began their nightly chorus, soft and steady. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles," she said after a while. "They're not just yours," he answered. "That town would crush anyone it can't control." She glanced up. "Even you?" He smiled faintly. "Especially me." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of fabric pulling through thread. "Thank you," she said at last, "for defending me, for not letting him speak to me that way." "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "Any decent man would have done the same." She met his eyes, her voice soft but steady. "Then there aren't many decent men left." Thomas's gaze held hers, and the air between them seemed to hum with the force of everything unspoken. Finally, he said, "Maybe there's just one, trying to be." The words settled over her like a whisper of warmth. She lowered her eyes, hiding the small, helpless smile that curved her lips. When she finished her sewing, she stood to put the basket away. Thomas rose at the same moment, and they nearly collided. His hand caught her arm instinctively, steadying her. The touch was light, but it sent a shiver through them both. "Sorry," he murmured, though he didn't immediately let go. "There's nothing to be sorry for," she whispered. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, the flicker of the lamp painting gold across his face, the faint rise and fall of her breath close enough to feel. Then he stepped back, his hand falling away, his voice rough. "Good night, Miss Holloway." "Good night, Mr. Rourke." When she reached her room, Margaret leaned against the door, her pulse racing. The wind outside had grown stronger, rattling the shutters like impatient fingers. She pressed her hand to her chest, willing her heart to calm. Downstairs, Thomas stood alone in the fading lamplight, staring at the doorway she had just left through. His jaw tightened, and he exhaled slowly, as though trying to steady a storm that had already taken root inside him. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and endless, but within the quiet walls of that small ranch house, something far greater had begun to stir, a longing neither of them dared to name, yet neither could deny. The wind carried the smell of smoke long before anyone saw the flames. It was faint at first, blending with the dry scent of the prairie, but when Margaret Holloway stepped outside with a lantern in hand, she felt the sting in her throat. The night sky glowed faintly orange to the east, near the feed shed. "Mr. Rourke!" she called, her voice sharp and frightened. From the barn came the sound of hurried footsteps. Thomas appeared within seconds, his shirt half-buttoned, his hair damp with sweat. "Stay back," he ordered, grabbing a bucket. "It's near the hay." But Margaret didn't listen. She ran after him, her skirts catching the wind, her breath burning in her chest. The flames had begun to climb the outer wall of the feed shed, licking at the dry wood like hungry tongues. The heat struck her face as Thomas threw water at the base of the fire, shouting for the ranch hands who were already racing from their quarters. "Fetch the other barrels!" he shouted. "Move!" Margaret grabbed another bucket, ignoring Della's cries from the porch. "I can help!" Thomas turned toward her, fury and fear flashing in his eyes. "You'll burn yourself alive." "Then let me burn beside you," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. He froze for half a second, the firelight painting her face gold and red, and then he nodded once. "Stay behind me. Keep the water low." Together they worked until their arms ached, until the smoke made their eyes sting, and the night was thick with shouts and steam. At last, the fire gave way to exhaustion. The flames hissed and shrank, leaving only glowing embers and blackened boards. Thomas stood with his hands on his knees, breathing hard. "That wasn't an accident," he said quietly. "Someone wanted this." Margaret coughed, pressing a hand to her chest. "But who would—" He cut her off. "Vickers, or someone paid by him." The other ranch hands exchanged uneasy looks but said nothing. Margaret watched as Thomas straightened, the moonlight catching the sweat on his brow. His face was hard, the muscles of his jaw clenched, but beneath that anger she saw something deeper, weariness and the terrible burden of trying to hold together a life built on land that others wished to see ruined. When the last of the men returned to their quarters, Thomas turned to her. "You shouldn't have been out here." "I told you," she said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't stay inside. You could have died." "So could you," she whispered. He looked away, swallowing hard. The firelight had faded, but its heat lingered in the air between them. Margaret's hair had come loose, falling over her shoulders in tangled strands. There were streaks of soot on her cheeks, and her hands shook slightly as she lowered the empty bucket. Thomas reached out slowly, his calloused fingers brushing against her wrist. "You shouldn't have to be part of this fight," he said softly. Her eyes lifted to his. "You think I haven't been fighting my whole life?" He stared at her, speechless for a moment, then said, "I think you deserve a world that doesn't make you prove your worth every day. And I think you deserve to believe that world can exist," she replied. Something in his expression broke then, a shadow cracking open to reveal something raw and real. His thumb traced a faint mark on her skin, almost without thought, and she didn't pull away. "Go inside," he said finally, his voice low, almost unsteady. "You're shaking." "So are you," she whispered. He let out a quiet breath, half a laugh and half despair. "You don't listen, do you?" "Not when I care," she said. Their eyes locked again, the space between them filled with the kind of silence that holds more meaning than words. Then, slowly, Thomas dropped his hand, breaking the spell. "Della will want to clean that burn on your arm," he said, and turned toward the barn. Margaret stood there long after he had gone, the scent of smoke clinging to her clothes, her heart beating too fast to name what she felt. Inside the house, Della clucked and scolded, dabbing at Margaret's arm with cool water. "Foolish girl," she muttered, "running into fire like that." Margaret winced. "I couldn't let him fight alone." Della stopped, her sharp eyes softening. "You've got it bad, don't you?" "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, you do," Della said, sitting back with a sigh. "You look at that man like he's the first sunrise you ever saw." Margaret's cheeks flushed. "He's good, decent, that's all." Della smiled faintly. "Maybe so, but don't mistake goodness for safety. Men like Thomas Rourke carry storms inside them. You get too close, and you'll feel the lightning." Margaret said nothing. She knew Della was right. But when she closed her eyes that night, all she saw was Thomas's hand, reaching for hers in the firelight, the way his voice had broken when he told her she deserved better. The next morning, the ranch smelled of wet ash and smoke. The feed shed was half ruined, but not lost. Thomas had been up since before dawn, speaking with the men and making notes in his ledger. Margaret brought him a cup of coffee, her fingers brushing against his as she handed it to him. "Thank you," he said quietly, meeting her eyes for a moment. "Did you sleep?" "Barely." "Neither did I." He set the cup down and rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not just the fire. There's something else. The fence on the north pasture was cut clean through last night. Whoever did this wants to break me piece by piece." "Then you'll rebuild piece by piece," she said. "You've done harder things." He looked at her, his brow furrowing. "Why do you believe in me?" "Because you make me believe in myself," she answered simply. The words hung in the air like something sacred. Thomas didn't reply. He only reached for his hat, his movements deliberate, as though he needed something to occupy his hands. "I have to check the herd," he said finally. "You'll stay close to the house." She nodded. though every part of her wanted to follow. When he rode out, Margaret stood on the porch, watching until he disappeared beyond the rise of the hill. The sky was pale blue, the kind that promises calm, but hides storms underneath. She turned back toward the blackened remains of the feed shed and noticed something near the door, a footprint in the soot. It was too large to belong to anyone from the ranch. She crouched to examine it, her heart quickening. The heel had a distinct cut in the leather, like a small notch. She remembered it from the mercantile. The man who had ridden in with Vickers wore boots just like that. "Della," she called, her voice tight. "Come see this." Della came hurrying from the kitchen, wiping her hands. When she saw the mark, she frowned. "Lord help us," she muttered. "You think it's him?" "I don't think," Margaret said. "I know." Della looked toward the road, her expression grim. "Best keep that to yourself for now. No sense stirring trouble until Mr. Rourke's ready for it." But Margaret wasn't sure she could stay silent. The thought of those men returning, of more fires, more fear, it filled her with a restless anger she didn't recognize in herself. That evening, when Thomas returned, she waited for him on the porch. His horse was coated in dust, and his shirt clung to his back from the heat. "Did you find anything?" she asked. He shook his head. "Tracks near the creek. Could be anyone." "Not anyone," she said, her voice firm. "I found a footprint this morning. It matches the man who came with Vickers." Thomas froze. "You're certain?" She nodded. "I'd swear it." He exhaled slowly, removing his hat. "Then this isn't just about the ranch. It's about control. Vickers wants to prove he can take anything he pleases." Margaret's voice trembled. "And you'll let him?" His eyes met hers, dark and steady. "Not while I have breath in me." The silence that followed was heavy but not hopeless. Margaret stepped closer, her hand brushing the edge of his sleeve. "Then you're not alone in this." He looked down at her hand, then back at her face. "You've already risked enough." "I'd risk more," she said softly, "if it means you'd stop carrying the world by yourself." Thomas's throat worked, as if the words caught there before he could speak them. Finally he said, "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because I might start believing them." The evening light bathed them in gold, the air thick with the scent of smoke and earth. Margaret's heart pounded, but she didn't look away. "Then believe them," she whispered. For a long moment neither moved. Then Thomas took a step back, his voice rough. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be worse." "Tomorrow will come whether we rest or not," she said gently. "But tonight is still ours." He hesitated, caught between reason and something far more dangerous. "You have a way of making even ruin sound like grace. And you have a way of pretending you don't need saving," she said. He gave a faint smile, weary and tender all at once. "Maybe it's not just the ranch I'm trying to protect anymore." Before she could answer, he turned and walked toward the barn, the last light of the sunset framing his silhouette. Margaret stood there until darkness swallowed the horizon. The air was cool now, the kind of stillness that comes only after disaster. She wrapped her arms around herself and whispered into the quiet, "You're not alone, Mr. Rourke. Not anymore." Inside, the embers of the fire from the night before still glowed faintly in the hearth, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything, and how, against all odds, they had stood together in the flames. The prairie had grown restless since the fire. Even the wind seemed sharper, carrying whispers of dust and tension that refused to settle. The days passed under an uneasy sun, and at night the horizon burned faintly with lightning that never reached the ground. It was the kind of stillness that came before another storm, one that had nothing to do with weather. Margaret Holloway stood on the porch as the last light faded, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. The ranch stretched wide before her, peaceful on the surface but heavy beneath the calm. She could feel it in the air, the sense that something unseen was moving closer. Thomas Rourke came up behind her, his steps quiet on the wood. "You should be inside," he said. "It's going to rain." "I like the smell of it," she replied softly, without turning. It makes the world feel clean again. He stopped beside her, crossing his arms as he watched the gathering clouds. Clean's not something this land gives easily. No, she said, glancing at him, but it gives second chances if you work hard enough. He looked at her then, really looked, and the faintest smile tugged at his lips. You sound like Della. I'll take that as a compliment. You should. She's the only one who's ever had the courage to argue with me and live to tell of it. Margaret laughed, a soft, fleeting sound that made him turn his head. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of laughter in this house. They stood in silence after that, the kind that spoke of comfort and unspoken words. When the first drops began to fall, Margaret tilted her face to the sky. The rain came light at first, cool against her skin. "You'll catch a chill," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "Then let me have this moment before you rescue me from it." "Rescue you?" he asked, voice low. "You've done more saving here than I have." Her gaze met his, steady and searching. "You don't really believe that." He said nothing, and for a long heartbeat the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. The smell of rain, the warmth of his nearness, the quiet struggle in his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "You should go in." She hesitated but obeyed, her skirt brushing the doorframe as she stepped inside. He followed, shaking the water from his hat. The lamplight turned the room golden, casting shadows that softened the lines of his face. Della had retired early, leaving supper covered on the table. The house felt emptier without her steady voice, filled instead with something fragile, something that hummed quietly between them. Margaret placed the coffee cup on the counter, her hands still trembling slightly. "I spoke with Mrs. Hill in town today," she said, her tone cautious. "She mentioned Vickers has been buying up more land, 5 farms since spring." Thomas nodded grimly. "He's closing his fist around the valley. Mine's the last he can't touch. Then he'll come for it." "I know." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "Thomas, he's not just using the bank. He's using people. I heard a name, one of the men who came to the ranch that day. He's been seen at Vickers' stables, paid in cash." Thomas's head snapped up. "How do you know that?" Margaret hesitated. "Because I asked." His expression darkened. "You went looking for him?" "I asked questions," she corrected, calm but firm. "Discreetly." "That's not the point," he said sharply. "You could have been hurt." She met his anger without flinching. "I've already been hurt, Thomas. I've survived worse than questions." He exhaled, rubbing a hand across his face. "You shouldn't have to be the one carrying this fight." "Neither should you," she said quietly. Their eyes locked, and the silence that followed was not anger. It was concern disguised as frustration, love disguised as caution. "I don't know how to protect what's left," he admitted at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I fix one thing, another breaks. Every time I trust someone, they sell me to the highest bidder. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I kept my head down, I could build something that would last." Margaret stepped closer, her tone soft but steady. "You have built something that lasts. You just can't see it because you're standing inside it." He frowned slightly, not understanding. "This house, this land, it's not just boards and fences," she continued. "It's the people who still believe in it. Della, your men, even me. You've given all of us a place to belong, and that's worth more than Vickers will ever own." Thomas's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to tell her how much her words meant, but the weight of them sat too deep for speech. Instead, he reached out, almost without realizing it, and brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. "Margaret," he said softly, her name a confession. Her breath caught. "Yes?" He dropped his hand, stepping back as though he had touched fire. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I shouldn't." "You shouldn't what?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He turned away. "Make promises I can't keep." She crossed her arms, more to hold herself together than out of defiance. "Then don't promise. Just be honest." He faced her again, eyes shadowed with the kind of honesty that costs a man his peace. "If I were honest, I'd tell you that I think of you every hour of the day, that I worry more when you're out of sight than I ever did about my debts. that you've become the one thing I can't bear to lose." The room seemed to hold its breath. The rain against the window grew louder, steady, and rhythmic. Margaret's voice was quiet, but it shook. "Then don't lose me." He looked at her, his chest rising with the effort of restraint. "You don't understand what it means to care for someone like this out here. Everything I love gets taken, burned or buried. I can't do that again." "Then don't push me away to save me," she said. "That's not protection, that's fear." His jaw tightened, but the fight was leaving him. He turned toward the table, his hand gripping the back of a chair, as though it anchored him to reason. "You deserve something better than this life. And you deserve someone who sees you the way I do," she whispered. He froze. Her words hit him harder than any blow. When he turned, his face was unguarded, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "How do you see me?" "As a man who's still standing," she said, "when the world has tried to knock him down over and over again. As someone who keeps building even when he's lost everything. As someone good." He closed his eyes briefly, fighting the emotion that rose too fast, too sharp. When he opened them, his voice was hoarse. "You make me want to believe you." "Then believe me," she said, stepping closer until the space between them was only a breath. "You don't have to fight the whole world alone anymore." The lantern light flickered, throwing gold across her face, her eyes luminous and unafraid. For a moment, Thomas forgot the world beyond those walls. His hand lifted, hesitated, then found hers. Their fingers fit together as if they'd done so 1,000 times before. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The quiet pulse of rain on the roof became their only witness. When he finally let go, it wasn't because he wanted to, but because he had to. "If we keep talking like this," he said softly, "I'll forget the reasons I built those fences outside." "Maybe fences aren't meant to keep people out," she replied. "Maybe they're meant to show us where we begin again." He smiled faintly, the sadness still in it. "You always find the gentler meaning." "I learned to look for light where no one else did," she said. He watched her for a long time before speaking again. "You should sleep. Tomorrow will bring more of Vickers's schemes, and I'll need my sharpest ally awake." She smiled. "Is that what I am?" "It's what I rely on," he answered. When she turned to go, he stopped her with a quiet voice. "Margaret!" She faced him, her hand still on the doorframe. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me what it feels like to hope." Her eyes softened. "Hope isn't something you remember, Thomas. It's something you choose." He nodded, his throat too tight for words. She left the room, her footsteps fading down the hall, and he stood alone, the sound of rain wrapping the house like a lullaby. He looked at the half-empty lantern, the flickering shadows, the worn table, and for the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt just a little lighter. Upstairs, Margaret lay awake, listening to the storm. Each roll of thunder seemed to echo the turmoil within her, the blend of fear and longing she could no longer separate. But beneath it all, there was something steady, an understanding that whatever lay ahead, she had already found her place in this world. Not because of where she was, but because of who she stood beside. Downstairs, Thomas finally extinguished the lamp, whispering to the dark, "You're not alone anymore." The words hung in the air like a promise, carried softly into the night by the rhythm of the rain. The morning sun rose over the prairie like a reluctant promise, pale and fragile after a night of rain. The ground was still wet, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. The light caught on the dew-soaked grass, turning the fields into 1,000 glittering mirrors. Margaret Holloway stood on the porch, watching Thomas Rourke saddle his horse. She had not slept much. Her mind had circled endlessly around the same thought. He was going out alone again. He tightened the last strap and adjusted his gloves. "The north fence needs checking," he said, keeping his voice steady. "If the rain washed out the line, we'll lose half the herd by morning." "And then let one of the men go," she said quickly. "You've worked enough these past days." He looked at her, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. "It's my land, Margaret. I have to see it myself." Her throat tightened. "Then take someone with you." A faint smile curved his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "If I bring another man, he'll talk the whole way and scare off the quiet." "This isn't a time for quiet," she whispered. "Something's wrong. You feel it too." He paused, his hand resting on the saddle horn. For a moment the mask slipped, the weary lines around his mouth deepened, and his gaze softened. "I'll be careful," he said. "I always am." Margaret stepped closer. The morning light touched her face, and Thomas caught the faint shimmer of worry in her eyes. "Careful doesn't stop bullets," she said, voice trembling. "Promise me you won't ride near the ridge. The ground's too soft." "I promise," he said, though both of them knew promises meant little on land like this. He mounted the horse, the leather creaking under his weight. Margaret lifted her chin, trying to hide the fear tightening her chest. "Then come back before sundown," she said. "I'll come back," he replied. He tipped his hat to her and rode out, the sound of hooves fading until all she could hear was the wind. Inside the house, Della Crowley busied herself with breakfast, pretending not to notice the tension. "He'll be fine," she said, setting a pan on the stove. "That man's too stubborn to get himself killed." Margaret tried to smile, but it faltered. Stubbornness isn't armor. The day dragged on, the hours heavy with silence. Margaret worked in the garden, her hands restless in the soil, but her mind was far from the earth. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind made her turn toward the road. By the time the sun began to lower, her anxiety had sharpened into dread. The first warning came from the distance, a horse galloping hard. She ran to the porch, heart pounding. It was one of the ranch hands, his face pale with fear. "Miss Holloway!" he shouted. "Mr. Rourke's been hurt!" The world tilted. "Where?" "Near the North Ridge. He's alive, but he's bleeding bad. We need help." Margaret didn't think. She grabbed a basket of cloths, a flask of whiskey, and followed the man out. The horse galloped through the mud, the wind tearing at her hair. The prairie blurred around her, endless and merciless. When they reached the ridge, she saw him. Thomas, slumped against a fallen branch, his shirt torn and blood seeping through the fabric. His horse grazed nearby, its flanks streaked with mud. Another ranch hand knelt beside him, pressing a cloth to his shoulder. Margaret fell to her knees beside Thomas, her hands trembling. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking. He opened his eyes slowly. "You shouldn't be here. And you shouldn't be bleeding in the dirt," she said, her tears spilling despite her control. He gave a faint, crooked smile. "It's only a graze." "It's not," she said, pressing her hand over his. "Don't lie to me." His fingers twitched beneath hers, seeking her touch. "Ambush," he said hoarsely. "Two men waiting by the fence. One fired. I didn't see the second until it was too late." Margaret's heart twisted. "You said you'd be careful." "I was," he murmured, "just not careful enough." They managed to lift him onto the wagon, and the ride back to the ranch was a blur of motion and pain. Margaret sat beside him, her hand never leaving his arm. Every time he winced, she whispered to him, her words soft and steady. "Stay with me. We're almost home." When they arrived, Della was already waiting with water and bandages. "Get him to the table," she ordered, her voice brisk, though her hands shook. Margaret helped as best she could, her dress stained with blood and dirt. When the wound was cleaned, she saw the bullet had grazed his shoulder, tearing deep but missing the bone. Relief and terror mingled in her chest. "Hold him steady," Della said. "This will burn." Thomas gritted his teeth as Della poured whiskey over the wound. Margaret pressed her hand to his, her thumb tracing slow circles over his skin. "Look at me," she whispered, "not at the pain." He did. Their eyes locked, and for a moment everything else fell away. The smell of whiskey, the sound of the storm gathering outside, even Della's hurried movements. All that existed was the weight of his gaze, fierce and unyielding, and the silent vow that neither of them would let go. When the worst of it passed, Della stepped back, wiping her hands. "He'll live," she said, "but he needs rest. Days of it." Thomas exhaled, sweat beading on his forehead. "There's no time for rest." Vickers can wait," Margaret said firmly. You can't. He tried to sit up, but she placed her hand on his chest, gentle but commanding. Please, she said, her voice trembling, don't make me watch you fall apart. The fight went out of him then. He leaned back, his breath uneven, his eyes searching hers. I hate seeing you afraid. Then stop giving me reasons to be. The faintest smile touched his lips. You sound like Della again. She's wiser than both of us, Margaret replied, though her voice broke halfway through. That night, the storm arrived in full. Rain pounded the roof, and thunder rolled across the plains. Margaret sat beside Thomas's bed, the lantern casting a warm glow over his pale face. His bandaged shoulder rose and fell with slow, steady breaths. He stirred once, his eyes half opening. You're still here, he murmured. Of course, she said softly. Where else would I be? You should rest. I will when you're out of danger. His gaze drifted to her face. You're not afraid of storms, are you? Not anymore. Why not? Because the only storm I ever feared, she said quietly, is lying in that bed. He smiled faintly, eyes closing again. Then I'll try not to thunder so loudly. She brushed her hand over his forehead, pushing a damp lock of hair aside. Sleep, she whispered. You're safe now. But as the night deepened, she realized she wasn't certain of that at all. There was something cruel and calculated behind the attack, something that wouldn't end with one failed ambush. Still, she stayed by his side, unwilling to let him face even his dreams alone. When dawn came, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and fragile. Thomas stirred again, wincing as he tried to move. Margaret was there instantly, her hand finding his. You should have let Della sit with me, he said weakly. She offered, Margaret replied, but I told her no. Why? She hesitated, her voice soft. Because I needed to see with my own eyes that you'd wake. He looked at her then, truly looked, as though seeing her for the first time all over again. You risked your life for me yesterday, and you'd have done the same. Not if it meant losing you, he said quietly. Her breath caught, and for a moment she forgot how to speak. The sunlight spilled through the window, catching on the edges of the quilt, turning everything gold. Don't say things like that, she whispered, though her eyes glistened. Why not? Because I'll start believing them. He smiled faintly, repeating her own words from nights ago. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. She lowered her head, unable to hide the tears that slipped down her cheeks. Thomas reached up with his uninjured hand, brushing one away with his thumb. You've been crying too much for me lately, he said softly. Then stop giving me reasons to, she replied, laughing through the tears. Their laughter was quiet, fragile, but it was the first real sound of peace the house had known in days. Outside, the world glistened in the aftermath of the storm, and though danger still lurked beyond the horizon, within the walls of the ranch, something stronger than fear had taken root, something that neither fire, nor bullets, nor time itself could undo. Margaret stayed beside him until his breathing deepened into sleep once more. Then, for the first time since the ambush, she allowed herself to rest her head on his hand, whispering into the stillness, You came back to me, just like you promised. And though he did not answer, his fingers curled faintly around hers, as if to say he always would. The days following the ambush passed in a strange, hushed rhythm. The house felt suspended between fear and tenderness, its every shadow heavy with unspoken truths. Outside, the prairie glimmered under a late summer sun, deceptively peaceful. But inside, the Rourke ranch seemed to hold its breath. Thomas's recovery was slow, though he refused to admit it. Margaret could see how the pain still caught him when he reached too quickly, or lifted something heavier than he should. He hid it behind his quiet strength. But she knew. She always knew. She found him one afternoon in the yard, trying to mend a gate with his injured arm still bound in linen. You shouldn't be doing that, she said, stepping toward him. He looked up, a faint smirk ghosting across his lips. If I wait until I'm healed, the gate will fall before I fix it. Margaret crossed her arms. Then let someone else fix it. "There's no one else who'll do it right," he replied, forcing the nail into place with his good hand. She sighed, taking the hammer from him. "Then at least let someone help." He watched her strike the nail with steady precision, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, the afternoon light catching in her hair. "You're determined to make me feel useless, aren't you?" he teased softly. "Not useless," she said without looking at him. "Human." The word hung in the air, tender and sharp all at once. Thomas swallowed hard. "It's been a long time since anyone saw me that way." Margaret lowered the hammer, her gaze meeting his. "Then you've been surrounded by the wrong kind of people." Before he could answer, the sound of approaching hooves broke the stillness. A rider came up the trail, dust rising behind him. Della appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's one of Vickers's men," she said grimly. Thomas's expression hardened. "Inside, both of you." But Margaret stood her ground. "No. If he has something to say, he can say it where I can hear it." The rider dismounted, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Mr. Rourke, I come on behalf of Mr. Vickers. He sends his regards. And a warning." Thomas's voice was calm, but low. "Tell your employer I've had enough of his warnings." "Then maybe you'll take this one seriously," the man said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "The bank will foreclose at the end of the month unless full payment is made. Mr. Vickers has already filed the papers. You've got 3 weeks. Thomas's jaw tightened, though his tone remained even. "He won't get this land." The man laughed, cold and smug. "He'll get everything sooner or later, even the company you keep." His eyes flicked toward Margaret, his smile turning cruel. Thomas took a step forward. "You'll leave now." The man hesitated, then backed toward his horse. "I'd watch your temper, Rourke. People talk enough about you and that woman already. They'll talk louder once you lose everything." He rode off before Thomas could respond, leaving a trail of dust and rage behind. Margaret stood frozen, her face pale. "He means to ruin you," she said softly. Thomas turned to her, his eyes burning with restrained fury. "He won't." "But if the bank—" "I'll find a way," he interrupted. She stepped closer. "And what about what he said about me? What they say in town?" He hesitated. "They're fools, Margaret. Let them talk." Her voice trembled. "You think words can't wound? Every look, every whisper cuts. They see me as something shameful, and I—" She broke off, turning away. Thomas reached for her arm, his touch gentle. "Look at me." She did, reluctantly, tears shining in her eyes. "You're not shameful," he said softly. "You never were. You've done nothing but work hard and stand tall in a world that wants to break you. I'd give everything I own before I'd let anyone make you believe otherwise." Her breath caught. "You already are giving everything, Thomas. You're fighting for land that's bleeding you dry." He looked away, jaw clenched. "This land is all I have left." "That isn't true," she said. "You have people who care about you. Della, the men who stand by you, and me." He turned back to her, startled by the quiet certainty in her tone. "And you?" "Yes," she whispered. "Me." The wind picked up then, rustling through the dry grass. They stood close enough to feel it move between them, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Thomas wanted to say something, to tell her what her words did to him, but all he managed was her name, spoken like a prayer. "Margaret." Her eyes met his, full of tenderness and fear. "Don't let him destroy you," she said. "Don't let Vickers take your soul, even if he takes everything else." He nodded once, unable to speak. That evening, as dusk bled into night, the ranch gathered around a small fire behind the barn. The men murmured about the deadline, their voices low and grim. Margaret brought them coffee, her hands steady despite the unease knotting her chest. Della watched her closely. "You shouldn't carry all this worry alone, child," Della said. "He's not the only one with fight in him." Margaret smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but he needs to believe someone still has faith in him." Della nodded. "Then give him that. But mind you, don't let faith turn to heartache." Later, when the fire had died down and the others had gone to their quarters, Margaret found Thomas still awake in the barn, sitting by the lamplight. The light threw soft gold over the rough plains of his face, catching the weariness in his eyes. "You should rest," she said, standing in the doorway. "I can't sleep," he admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see everything I could lose." She stepped closer, her voice gentle. "You won't lose yourself, not while you're fighting for what's right." He gave a short, tired laugh. "What's right doesn't always win out here." "Then we make it win," she said firmly, "even if it takes everything we have." Her determination made him smile, soft, weary, but real. "You're braver than you know, Margaret Holloway." She sat beside him on the bench, their shoulders nearly touching. "No, I just learned from someone who refuses to give up, no matter how many times the world tries to break him." He looked at her then, really looked, and in that moment, something inside him seemed to give way. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "You have a way of seeing light where I see only ruin. That's what love is, isn't it?" she said before she could stop herself. The word hung between them, trembling. Thomas's breath caught. "Margaret." She closed her eyes, as if bracing for the storm she'd just invited. "I didn't mean to say it like that." "But you meant it," he said softly. She nodded. "Yes." The silence that followed was thick with everything they hadn't dared to say. Thomas reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed his fingers against hers. "You deserve a better man than me," he said, his voice rough. "Don't say that. It's true. I've got nothing left to offer you but a house built on debt and danger." "I don't want a house," she whispered. "I want the man who built it." His eyes closed for a moment, as if the weight of her words was too much. When he opened them again, they were full of something raw and beautiful. "You have no idea what you're doing to me." "Yes, I do," she said, "because you're doing the same to me." For a heartbeat they sat there, the air between them alive with everything they felt but hadn't dared to touch. Then Thomas leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their foreheads met, a breath apart, the closeness aching in its restraint. "If I kiss you," he murmured, "I don't know if I'll be able to stop." "Then don't stop," she whispered. But he did. He drew back, his hands trembling. "Not like this," he said. "Not when I don't know what tomorrow brings." She smiled through the tears she hadn't realized had fallen. "Tomorrow will come whether we face it together or apart." He shook his head, torn between reason and desire. "You're the only thing that makes me forget the rest of it." "Then don't forget," she said softly. "Remember that I'm here, that I chose this place, this life, and you." For a moment, he could only look at her, the depth of emotion in his gaze enough to break her heart and mend it all at once. "You make it sound simple," he said. "It's not," she replied, "but love never is." The lantern flickered, its light dimming to a gentle glow. Thomas finally exhaled, long and slow, as if surrendering to something greater than his will. "You've given me something to fight for again," he said quietly. "You already had it," she replied. "You just didn't know." When she rose to leave, he caught her hand. "Margaret," he said, his thumb brushing against her knuckles, his voice low and unsteady. "If this all falls apart, promise me you'll find peace somewhere, anywhere." She turned to him, her expression tender and defiant. "The only peace I've found is here. Don't ask me to leave it behind." He let her go then, though the ache in his chest told him he never truly could. Outside, the wind had stilled, and the stars shone cold and clear above the plains. Margaret paused on the porch, her heart still pounding from the weight of everything unsaid. Inside, Thomas sat in silence, staring at the empty doorway where she had stood, knowing that no matter what came next, she had already changed everything. And though the night around them was heavy with uncertainty, there was also something else, a quiet, fierce hope that refused to die, born from two hearts that had finally found the courage to love in a world that had given them every reason to stop believing. The night before the auction dawned heavy with silence. The prairie, usually restless even under moonlight, lay still, as if holding its breath. Inside the Rourke ranch house, the air was thick with worry and resignation. Della moved quietly from the kitchen to the sitting room, pretending to tidy things that did not need tidying, her old heart aching for what she could not stop. The papers from the bank sat on the table, cruel and final. Tomorrow, the land would be auctioned to the highest bidder unless the debt was paid in full, and everyone knew who that bidder would be. Harlan Vickers. Thomas Rourke sat by the dying fire, his shirt open at the collar, the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hands were clasped together, the knuckles pale. He had been staring at the same embers for hours. Margaret Holloway stood by the window, her reflection pale against the glass, her eyes following the outline of the dark horizon where his fences stretched like scars across the earth. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You should rest, Thomas." He shook his head without looking up. "I wouldn't sleep." "You haven't eaten all day." He gave a humorless laugh. "There's not much appetite for food when you're watching your life slip away." She turned from the window and walked toward him, the hem of her dress brushing softly against the floorboards. "You haven't lost it yet." "Tomorrow's a sunrise away," he said, his tone bitter. "A sunrise Vickers has been waiting for." Margaret sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though they trembled. "You're not a man who gives up." He looked at her then, his gaze raw. "Maybe I've just been pretending not to." "You don't mean that." "Don't I?" His voice cracked. "I've fought for every inch of this land, every dollar, every piece of pride, and still it's not enough. Maybe that's all life is out here, pretending you're not beaten until the dust covers you completely." Margaret reached forward, her fingers brushing his arm. The contact was small, but it silenced him instantly. "You're wrong," she said softly. "You've built something that matters. Not because of land or cattle or fences, but because of who you are. You've given people a place to belong." He shook his head. "I can't keep them safe. I can't even keep you safe." Her eyes glistened. "You've already done more than anyone ever did for me. If I leave this place tomorrow with nothing, I'll still have more than I had the day I came here." The room grew still again. The fire popped softly, and the wind outside sighed against the window panes. Thomas's gaze dropped to her hands. Small, scarred, strong. The hands that had rebuilt his home piece by piece, stitched his wounds, softened his solitude. He reached out, taking her fingers in his. "Margaret," he murmured, "you don't owe me anything." "I'm not talking about debts," she said. "I'm talking about love." He froze, the words striking deeper than any bullet ever could. "Don't," he whispered, shaking his head. "Don't say that." "Why not?" "Because I can't give you what you deserve. You think this," he gestured toward the house, the land beyond, "is a life. It's a fight that never ends, a storm that doesn't pass." Margaret's voice trembled, but held steady. "Then I'll stand in the storm with you." Her words were quiet, but they hit him like thunder. He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening as if holding back everything he'd never dared to say. When he spoke again, his voice was rough, unguarded. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do," she insisted. "I've known it since the day you told me I was safe here." Thomas looked at her, and for a long moment neither moved. Then, slowly, he rose from the chair. The firelight caught the exhaustion in his face, the shadow of his beard, the hollowness beneath his eyes. "You should hate me," he said. "You came here to serve a man who can't even save his own home." Margaret rose too. "I came here to start over, and you're the reason I can." He shook his head, his breath uneven. "You make me believe in things I have no right to believe in." "Then believe anyway," she whispered. Something inside him broke then, not with violence but with surrender. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her cheek. She did not move away. Her skin was warm beneath his rough fingers, her breath trembling as his thumb traced the edge of her jaw. "Margaret," he said softly, "if I cross this line, there's no turning back." She looked up at him, her voice barely audible. "Then don't look back." Their foreheads touched, their breaths mingling, and for that one fragile instant time stood still. The world outside, the debts, the danger, the judgment, fell away. All that remained was the slow, steady rhythm of two hearts finding each other in the ruins. But Thomas pulled back before the moment could break completely. His hand lingered on her cheek for one heartbeat longer, then fell away. "Tomorrow changes everything," he said hoarsely. "If Vickers wins, you can't stay here." She stared at him. "You mean to send me away?" "I mean to keep you safe. I won't go." "You will," he said, his tone firm but hollow. "There's a wagon leaving for Abilene after the auction. Della will go with you." Margaret's chest tightened. "And what about you?" He hesitated. "If I stay, I'll make sure Vickers never gets what he came for." She took a step closer, her eyes flashing. "And if that means you die trying?" He said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Margaret's voice cracked. "You can't keep sacrificing yourself for everyone else. Who will fight for you when you're gone?" He looked at her then, his expression softening. "You already do." The words undid her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't hide them. "Then let me stay," she said. "Let me stand beside you." "I can't," he whispered. "You can," she pleaded. "You just won't." Thomas turned away, his hand running through his hair as though trying to steady the storm inside him. "If anything happened to you—" "Something already did," she said, her voice breaking. "I fell in love with you, and I'm not leaving because of that." He froze, his breath catching audibly. Slowly, he turned back to face her, his eyes dark with emotion. "Say that again." "You heard me." He stepped closer, his hand trembling as he reached for her. "You shouldn't have said it," he murmured, his voice unsteady. "Because now I don't think I can let you go." She met his gaze, tears glistening on her lashes. "Then don't." He leaned in, but stopped just short, the air between them charged with everything unsaid. "If I kiss you now, it'll be goodbye," he whispered. "Then make it worth remembering," she said. He hesitated only a second longer before giving in. Their lips met, soft and searching, filled with all the longing and fear that had lived unspoken between them. It wasn't the kiss of victory or promise. It was the kiss of two souls holding on to something beautiful before the world could take it away. When they finally parted, their foreheads stayed pressed together, their breaths uneven. Thomas closed his eyes. "You should hate me for this," he said. "I never could," she replied, her voice trembling. "No matter what happens tomorrow, I'll never regret loving you." He pulled back, his eyes glistening in the dim firelight. "You've already given me more than I deserve," she smiled faintly. "And you've already given me everything I needed." The silence that followed was soft and sacred. The fire had burned low, casting shadows across the walls that flickered like ghosts of the past. When she finally turned to leave, Thomas didn't stop her. He watched her walk to the doorway, her figure framed by the faint light of dawn breaking over the fields. She paused, looking back at him one last time. "Promise me you'll fight for yourself, not just for this land," she said. He met her gaze, his voice quiet but sure. "If I fight for anything tomorrow, it'll be because of you." She nodded once, her throat too tight for words, and left the room. Thomas sank back into his chair, his hands trembling. The house was silent again, but it no longer felt empty. The air still carried her warmth, her voice, the trace of hope she had left behind. Outside, the first light touched the prairie, turning the wet earth to gold. It was a new day, the day everything would change. But for one fragile moment, Thomas allowed himself to close his eyes and feel the memory of her lips against his. The echo of her words in his heart. Whatever came next, he knew one truth would outlive the debts, the battles, and the pain. Margaret Holloway had given him back his soul. Morning arrived without kindness. The sky was the color of tin, as if the heavens had decided not to choose between sun and storm. The prairie lay quiet in that particular way it did when men were about to make decisions they could not undo. Inside the ranch house, The air held the faint scent of coffee and ash, of clean linen and old fear. Every sound seemed sharper than it ought to be, the creak of a floorboard, the soft clink of a cup, the steady breath of the wind against the shutters. Thomas Rourke stood at the wash basin with his sleeves rolled, the water running over his hands, as if he could rinse away the night. He had shaved more carefully than usual, not for vanity, but because a man facing a public reckoning clung to small things he could control. His shoulder still ached when he moved wrong, a quiet reminder that danger did not ask permission before it entered a life. He dressed in his best vest, the one that fit close to his body and made him look, for all the fatigue in his eyes, like a man who could not be pushed aside. Margaret watched from the doorway. Her hair was pinned neatly, her calico dress brushed clean, her collar fastened high. She looked composed, almost serene, but her hands betrayed her. Her fingers kept curling into the fabric of her apron, then releasing, then curling again, as if she were holding back a tremor that belonged to her heart. Thomas turned and found her gaze. "You should stay here," he said, his voice low and careful. "Della will take you into town afterward, like we planned." Margaret stepped forward until the distance between them was small enough to feel. "I'm not going anywhere," she replied. His jaw tightened. "Margaret." "No," she said softly, and the softness made it sharper. "You don't get to decide where I go today. You don't get to send me away like a package you're afraid to drop." Pain flashed across his face, the kind that had nothing to do with his shoulder. "I'm trying to protect you. And I'm trying to live," she answered. She lifted her chin, and her voice steadied. "If you walk into that room alone, you will carry every insult, every threat, every lie on your shoulders. You will stand there while they look at you like you're already defeated. I will not let you do it without someone who knows the truth standing beside you." He stared at her as if she were something wild and impossible. "They'll come for you." "Let them," she whispered. "I'm done bending my head for people who only understand cruelty." From the kitchen, Della Crowley cleared her throat. She had been listening with the quiet patience of a woman who had spent her life watching storms gather. Now she stepped into view, her cap tied firm, her apron spotless, her eyes sharp as nails. She held a small bundle of papers wrapped in cloth. "Arguing won't change what's already set in motion," Della said, "but it might change how you face it." Thomas looked at the bundle. "What's that?" Della's mouth tightened. "Something I should have shown you sooner. I kept it because I've lived long enough to know men like Vickers don't stop at one victim." She placed the bundle on the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside were folded documents, worn at the edges, ink faded but legible. Margaret leaned in, her breath catching. Della pointed to one page. "This is a receipt, signed by a man who worked for Vickers years ago. Payment for arrangements. That's what they called it when a rancher's fence went down, or his feed went missing, or his name got dragged through mud until he sold for pennies." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Why didn't you give me this before?" "Because you weren't ready," Della said bluntly. "And because I wasn't sure I could trust anyone in that town to do right by it. But today," her gaze moved to Margaret, "today we've got a woman with a spine made of iron and a heart that refuses to be shamed into silence." Margaret swallowed, steadying herself. "It's not just this," she said quietly. She crossed the room and opened a drawer where she kept her own ledger, the one she'd begun, without fanfare. She laid it beside Della's documents. "I wrote down every delivery, every stranger's visit, every time the fence line showed fresh tracks, every time the men from the bank arrived with that polished smile. I wrote down the shape of the boot print by the feed shed, the notch in the heel." Thomas looked at her as if the room had shifted under him. "You did all that?" "I did what I had to do," she replied, "because I knew no one would save you if we didn't build the truth ourselves." A knock sounded at the door, hard, urgent. One of the ranch hands stood outside with another man beside him, lean and dust-worn, his hat clenched between restless hands. Margaret recognized him from the yard, from the edges of conversations. Jed Carter rarely spoke, unless he had reason. Jed's eyes darted to Thomas. "I need to tell you something," he said, voice rough. "I should have told you before." Thomas stepped onto the porch. "Say it." Jed swallowed. "I saw it. The night of the fire. Not the flames. Before that. I saw a rider near the shed. I couldn't swear the face, but I know the boot. That notch, same as the man who came with the bank. And I saw him again days earlier in town, taking money from Vickers by the stables. I kept my mouth shut because I thought it'd get me killed." Thomas's expression didn't soften, but something like relief flickered through it. "You're telling it now." Jed's gaze dropped. "Because I saw Miss Holloway stand in front of men who wanted to crush her, and she didn't flinch. And I thought, maybe courage spreads." Margaret's throat tightened, but she only nodded, accepting the quiet tribute as if it belonged to the work, not to her pride. Thomas turned back inside. For a moment he stood very still, as if fighting the instinct to take the burden back onto his own shoulders. Then he exhaled once, slow and deep, and looked at Margaret. "All right," he said. "If you're coming with me, not behind me." Her eyes shone. "That's all I wanted." The courthouse in town smelled of ink and old wood, and men who believed they owned the world. Outside, a small crowd gathered, whispers weaving through the air like thread pulled too tight. The auction was a spectacle dressed in legality, and people came the way they came to see a storm. Part curiosity, part hunger, part relief. It wasn't their roof being torn apart. Thomas walked in with his shoulders squared. Margaret walked beside him, head high, her hands calm at her sides, though her heart hammered beneath her ribs. Della followed, small but unyielding. Jed trailed behind, eyes watchful. And there, like a stain that refused to wash out, stood Harlan Vickers. He was dressed as if for a celebration. His suit was immaculate, his watch chain gleaming. His smile came easily, polished and cold. When he spotted Thomas, he lifted his chin in lazy triumph. When he saw Margaret, the smile sharpened. "Mr. Rourke," Vickers said smoothly, "and you brought an audience." Thomas's voice was quiet. "You're done." Vickers chuckled. "Bold words from a man who's about to lose everything." Margaret stepped forward before Thomas could speak. The crowd's whispers swelled, the way they always did when a woman refused to remain invisible. "My name is Margaret Holloway," she said, her voice clear, not loud, but carrying. "And I have something to submit before this auction proceeds." Vickers's eyes narrowed. "You think you have the right to—" "I do," she said, cutting through him without raising her tone, "because what's happening here isn't business. It's extortion dressed in paper." A visiting circuit judge had been seated at a desk near the front, called in for docket matters and drawn into the gathering by the commotion. He looked up now, expression stern. "Who is speaking?" Margaret approached with the ledger held carefully in both hands. "I am, Your Honor, and I have records that connect Mr. Vickers to threats, sabotage, and hired intimidation meant to force a foreclosure." The judge's gaze flicked to Thomas. "Mr. Rourke?" Thomas's voice was steady. "She speaks the truth." Vickers laughed, too quick. "This is absurd. A ranch hand's gossip and a woman's scribbles." "They are not scribbles," Margaret said. Her cheeks flushed, but her eyes remained unbroken. "They are dates, names, observations. A record of what the men in this town prefer to call bad luck when it happens to someone they don't care to defend." Della stepped forward then, placing her own documents on the desk with a sharp, practiced motion. "And these are older than her ledger, Your Honor, proof that Mr. Vickers has used the same methods before." Jed cleared his throat and stepped into view. "I'll testify," he said, voice shaking but sure. "About the man by the feed shed, about the money near the stables, about what I saw." The judge's expression hardened with something more than interest. He lifted one of the papers, scanned it, then set it down as if it burned. "This auction will not proceed," he said, voice cutting through the room. A shock went through the crowd. A dozen mouths opened at once, half outrage, half delight at the scent of scandal. Vickers took a step forward, his composure cracking. "You cannot—" "I can." The judge replied, cold as winter. "And I will. If even half of this is verified, there are criminal matters here, not merely civil debt." Vickers's gaze snapped to Margaret, poisonous. "This is what you are," he hissed under his breath, "a schemer, a parasite clinging to a man's weakness." Margaret's voice didn't tremble. "No," she said softly, "I am a woman who was traded like an object, and I learned what happens when men like you count on silence. I won't be silent again." Thomas moved, not with violence, but with a kind of controlled fury that made the room go still. He stepped between them, his body a shield without arrogance. "You will not speak to her," he said, each word measured, lethal in its calm, "as if she belongs beneath you." Vickers smiled, thin and desperate. "And you'll stand up for her now when everyone knows what she is?" Thomas didn't look away. "I know exactly what she is. She's the bravest person in this room." For a moment the world narrowed to a single breath. Margaret's chest tightened, and her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. Not here, not in front of people who had been waiting for her to break. The judge called for an officer not beholden to local influence, and within minutes the courthouse shifted from theatre to reckoning. Vickers's face went pale, his confidence draining in real time as authority turned its gaze on him instead of worshipping him. When it was done, when the injunction was signed, when the papers were gathered, when the crowd spilled back onto the street with gossip sparking like wildfire, Thomas and Margaret stepped into the sunlight as if into a new world. They stood near the hitching rail, the noise of town moving around them, but it might as well have been miles away. Thomas looked at Margaret, and something in his expression gave way. Exhaustion, relief, awe, and a tenderness so fierce it almost hurt to witness. "You did that," he said, voice rough. "We did," she corrected gently. His eyes darkened and his hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed the side of her glove with the back of his fingers, the smallest touch, as if he were asking permission without words. "You saved my home," he murmured. Margaret's voice softened. "You gave me one first." Thomas swallowed. The space between them felt charged, alive. "I can't give you riches," he said. "I can't promise there won't be hard seasons." She gave a trembling smile. "I didn't fall in love with your seasons. I fell in love with you." He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, as if her words were too much to carry. When he opened them again, there was decision there. Not fear, not hesitation. "Then marry me," he said quietly. Margaret's breath caught. Thomas stepped closer, not as a bargain, not as rescue, not as repayment. "Marry me, because I want to wake up in a world where you're beside me, and I want every day I have left to be worthy of that." Her eyes filled. "Thomas." "And before you answer," he added, voice shaking, "I need you to know something. I'll never claim you as property, not with papers, not with vows, not with my name." Margaret reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his calloused palm. "Then here is my condition," she whispered. "I keep my wages. I keep my choices. I keep my name until I decide otherwise." Thomas's gaze held hers with reverence. "Yes," he said, "all of it, always." The answer broke free from her like a prayer. Yes. The wedding was not grand, but it was beautiful in the way truth often is. Plain, honest, radiant. Della fussed like a woman trying to pretend she wasn't sentimental, her mouth stern while her eyes shone. The ranch hands stood awkwardly in their clean shirts, hats pressed to their chests. The preacher's words were simple, but the air around the porch felt like something sacred. Margaret wore a modest dress she had sewn with her own hands, the fabric new, but the stitches familiar, as if she were binding her past into something that could finally hold. Thomas looked at her as though he couldn't believe the world had allowed him this miracle. When the vows were spoken, there was no flourish, just honesty. "I choose you," Margaret said, voice steady, "and I choose the life we build with truth." "I choose you," Thomas replied, his voice breaking, "and I swear you will never be afraid under my roof again." Afterward, When the sun dipped low and the prairie turned soft with evening, Thomas led her onto the porch. The wind was gentle for once, almost shy. He placed a folded document in her hand. "What is this?" she asked, brows knitting. "A protection," he said quietly. "A deed amendment. It doesn't make you mine, it makes you safe. If anything happens to me, you keep this home. No man can trade you, claim you, or throw you out, not ever." Margaret stared at the paper, then up at him, her eyes shining so brightly it hurt. "Thomas, you didn't have to." "I did," he whispered. "Because love isn't just feeling. It's building a world where the person you love can breathe." Her hand shook as she set the paper aside and reached for him. "Then hold me," she said, voice barely audible. "Not like I'm fragile, like I'm real." Thomas's arms circled her with careful strength, and when she leaned into him, the entire world seemed to quiet, as if the prairie itself had chosen to listen. They moved together slowly, a gentle sway across the porch boards. No music, but the whisper of wind and the steady beat of two hearts that had fought too long to be alone. Margaret lifted her face toward his, her eyes luminous in the fading light. "We won," she whispered. Thomas pressed his forehead to hers. "No," he said softly. "We survived, and now we get to live." Under the first stars, with the ranch behind them and the open plains ahead, they stood as if they had always belonged there, two wounded souls, not rescued by fate, but redeemed by choice. And in Thomas's arms, Margaret finally felt what she had once believed was only a story other women were allowed to have. A home that could not be bought. A love that could not be taken. The prairie had changed in 9 years, though the wind still sang the same low, eternal song. Grass grew where the feed shed had once burned, and the fences stretched farther now, clean and well kept. The Rourke ranch stood sturdy against the horizon, its whitewashed boards touched by age, but softened by care. The world had grown quieter since those days of dust and fear, but it had not forgotten. Thomas Rourke stood on the porch that morning, the sun cresting over the fields like a familiar friend. His hair had silvered at the temples, and the years had written faint lines at the corners of his eyes, but his back was still straight, his gaze still clear. He leaned against the railing, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, and watched the two children racing through the grass beyond the barn. Samuel was 8, all elbows and determination, his hair the same deep brown as his mother's. He chased his little sister Clara, who shrieked with laughter and held a ribbon just out of reach. Their laughter echoed across the yard, bright and untamed, the sound of a life rebuilt. Margaret stepped out beside Thomas, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. Her face, though touched by time, carried the same grace that had once silenced a courthouse full of men. She no longer wore fear in her expression. Instead, there was quiet pride, a woman who had weathered every storm and learned not only to survive, but to belong. Thomas smiled faintly as she joined him. "They're going to wear out that ribbon before the morning's done." Margaret's eyes followed the children, soft with affection. "Then I'll sew them another. It's a small price to pay for joy." He chuckled. "You've always been too generous." She glanced at him, her voice gentle. "And you too stubborn to accept it." He turned to her, taking her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing. The weight of the years between them was light compared to what they had carried before. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked quietly. "Those days, before everything changed." Margaret's eyes drifted toward the horizon. "Sometimes," she said, "but it feels like another lifetime. Like we were different people back then, half alive waiting for something we couldn't name." Thomas nodded. "I remember thinking I'd lost everything worth keeping. And I remember thinking I'd never be anything more than what the world told me I was," she said softly. Then she smiled. "And yet, here we are." He squeezed her hand. "Here we are." The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of hooves. A single rider approached from the road. A woman in a blue traveling coat, her figure straight despite the years. Della Crowley had aged, but she was still sharp, her grey hair tucked neatly beneath her hat. The old mare she rode ambled up to the gate as if it knew the way by heart. Margaret went to meet her, arms outstretched. "You came." "I told you I would," Della said, dismounting with surprising agility. "A promise is a promise. You didn't think I'd let these children grow up without a proper scolding now and then, did you?" Margaret laughed, embracing her tightly. "The house hasn't been the same without your voice." Della looked past her to Thomas, who tipped his hat in greeting. "You still breathing, Rourke?" "Mostly," he said with a smile. "The house keeps me honest." "Good," Della said, her tone softening. "You both deserved a little peace after all you endured." They walked back to the porch together, the three of them bound by years of hardship and hard-won happiness. The land around them told the story better than any words could. The fences rebuilt, the fields rich again, the scars healed, but never erased. Later that afternoon, after the children had gone down for their nap, Thomas rode out to the far ridge. The wind was stronger there, carrying with it the faint hum of the river below. From that height he could see everything: the town in the distance, the ranch spread wide, and the graves near the willow tree where the land sloped gently east. One of those graves bore the name Harlan Vickers. Time had not been kind to him. After his arrest, he had lived only a few years, a man consumed by bitterness and the ghosts of his own making. Few attended his burial. Fewer still spoke his name. The valley he had tried to own now thrived under the hands of those he had once sought to destroy. Thomas dismounted, removed his hat, and stood a moment in silence. Not out of pity, but out of understanding. There was no victory in watching another man's ruin, only the quiet recognition of how thin the line between righteousness and ruin could be. When he returned to the house, Margaret was waiting by the door. She could always tell where he had been, just by the look in his eyes. "You went to the ridge," she said softly. He nodded. "Old ghosts. Do they still speak to you?" He smiled faintly. "Not as loud as they used to." She reached up, brushing her fingers along his cheek. "Then let them fade. You've done enough remembering for one life." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "You're the reason I can forget." That evening, as twilight fell, the house filled with warmth and light. Della read stories to the children by the hearth, while Margaret finished sewing at the table, her needle glinting in the lamplight. Thomas sat nearby, carving small wooden figures, a habit he had taken up during quieter winters. The sound of laughter filled the air, blending with the crackle of the fire. It was the kind of peace that once felt too fragile to dream of, and now it lived here, in every breath. When the children were asleep and Della had retired, Thomas and Margaret stepped out onto the porch. The prairie stretched wide under a sky heavy with stars. The cicadas sang their steady hymn, and the smell of summer grass carried through the night. Margaret leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't found each other?" Thomas's voice was soft. "No," he said, "because I can't imagine it." She smiled. "Neither can I." He turned to her then, his gaze tender, full of quiet awe. "You were traded once," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "but I was the one who ended up rich." Her eyes filled with tears that shimmered in the starlight. "You gave me something no man could buy," she whispered. "A life that's mine." Thomas brushed his thumb along her jaw, his heart too full for words. "And you gave me one worth living." The wind rose gently, carrying the sound of the fields. The same song it had always sung, but now it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like home. In the years that followed, the Rourke Ranch became known not for its wealth or its size, but for the decency of the people who worked it. Travelers passing through spoke of a house with a red door and a woman who never turned away a soul in need. They spoke of a man who had learned that love, not land, was the measure of a legacy. And on quiet nights when the children were grown and the seasons turned once more, Thomas and Margaret still sat together on that porch. Their hands, aged and calloused, always found each other. Time had changed their faces, but not their hearts. The prairie had tested them, broken them, and remade them, but in the end it had kept its promise. It had given them a love that endured the storm. And as the stars turned above the open land, Margaret Holloway Rourke smiled, knowing that somewhere in the hush between wind and earth, the past had finally laid itself to rest. Every love story leaves behind a lesson, sometimes whispered, sometimes carved deep into the heart. Traded for an old horse reminds us that even from the darkest bargains, something beautiful can be born. Margaret and Thomas taught us that love is not a rescue, but a rebuilding, not a possession, but a promise freely chosen every single day. They faced ruin, shame, and fear, and still they stood side by side, proving that dignity and tenderness can survive any storm. Their home was never built of wood and stone alone. It was built of faith, courage, and the decision to keep loving when the world made it hardest to do so. If this story touched your heart, tell us what it meant to you in the comments below. I'd love to know what part stayed with you the longest, what emotion surprised you the most, or which scene made you believe in love again. And if you've reached this very last moment of their journey, write the word home in the comments, because that's what this story was truly about. Finding, creating, and protecting a home not made of walls, but of hearts that choose each other. If you wish to help us continue bringing you these deeply emotional period romances, you can leave a super thanks on YouTube with any amount that feels right to you. Your kindness keeps this channel alive and helps our small creative team keep telling stories that move souls. And if you can't support us that way, sharing this video with a friend who loves historical dramas is just as powerful. Every share helps this story find the hearts it was meant to reach. Thank you for being here, for feeling every word, and for believing, just like Margaret and Thomas, that love can still conquer silence, shame, and time itself. Now before you go, I invite you to watch the other stories linked in the cards above, tales of hope, courage, and impossible love that, like this one, remind us that the heart always finds its way home.